A storm and a stranger. The storm rolled in faster than expected. Dark clouds swallowed the sun, turning midday into an eerie twilight. The wind howled through the towering iron gates of the Carter estate, rattling the ornate lanterns that lined the driveway. Rain began to fall, heavy and relentless, drumming against the windows of the grand mansion. Inside, Ashton Carter, the sole heir to the Carter fortune, lounged on the velvet sofa in the study, his fingers absent-mindedly flipping through the pages of a thick novel. His world was one of luxury and expectation, heir to a multi-million-dollar empire, groomed for business, and raised under the sharp, watchful eye of his legal guardian, Mr. Warren Sterling. Despite his wealth, Ashton often felt like a prisoner in his own home. Every move he made was calculated, every decision scrutinized. Outside, the storm worsened. Through the large windows, Ashton noticed a figure huddled near the mansion's front gate, barely visible through the sheets of rain. A woman, wrapped in a thin, tattered coat, sat slumped against the stone pillar, her body shivering violently from the cold. Ashton frowned. The estate was miles away from the city. There was no reason for anyone to be out here in this weather. His heart clenched with something foreign. Pity, guilt, responsibility. He wasn't sure, but something about the way she sat there, as if she had nowhere left to go, made him uneasy. Without thinking, Ashton pushed off the sofa and strode toward the front door. Master Carter. A sharp voice stopped him. It was Mr. Sterling, stepping into the hallway, his silver-rimmed glasses glinting under the chandelier. His presence was as imposing as ever, tall, neatly dressed, and always in control. "Where are you going?" Sterling asked, his voice measured but firm. Ashton hesitated, glancing back at the woman outside. "There's someone at the gate. She looks like she needs help." Sterling's jaw tightened. "Homeless people are everywhere, Ashton. You cannot help them all. This is a private property. She shouldn't be here." Ashton's fingers curled into fists at his sides. "So we just leave her out there in the storm?" His voice held an edge of defiance. Sterling sighed as if dealing with a naive child. "It's not our concern." Ashton didn't reply. Instead, he turned on his heel, ignoring the older man's protests, and swung the heavy front doors open. The wind roared against him like a warning. He ran through the rain, his designer shoes splashing in the puddles as he reached the gate. The woman flinched at his approach, lifting her face slightly. Deep brown eyes, weary but familiar. "Miss," Ashton said, kneeling in front of her. Up close, he noticed how frail she looked. Her cheekbones sharp, her lips cracked from the cold. Her thin hands clutched at her coat, as though holding it together was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. She blinked up at him, confusion flashing across her features. "Why?" Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "Why are you helping me?" Ashton hesitated, unable to answer. He didn't know why. Something about her pulled at him, like a memory long buried. "Come inside," he said finally. "You'll freeze out here." The woman hesitated. Fear flickered in her eyes, but desperation won out. Slowly, she nodded. Ashton helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as they made their way back up the driveway. Rain drenched them both, but he barely noticed. When they stepped through the grand front doors, Mr. Sterling stood there, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "This is a mistake," Sterling warned. Ashton ignored him. The woman shivered violently as she stepped onto the expensive marble floors, dripping water onto the pristine surface. She clutched her coat tighter around herself, eyes darting around the grand entryway, as if stepping into another world. "You can warm up by the fireplace," Ashton offered, motioning towards the grand sitting room. She nodded weakly and took a step forward, then stopped abruptly. Her gaze had locked onto something. No, someone. Ashton followed her stare to his own wrist. His wet sleeves had pulled back slightly, revealing the crescent-shaped birthmark just below his palm. The woman staggered, gasping sharply. Ashton barely had time to react before she whispered, almost in disbelief, "It's you." Then, before anyone could catch her, she collapsed onto the floor. Shadows of the past. Ashton barely had time to react before the woman collapsed onto the cold marble floor. His heart pounded as he knelt beside her. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. Rainwater pooled around her, soaking into the expensive flooring, but he didn't care. "Call the doctor." Ashton barked, looking up at Mr. Sterling, who stood a few feet away, unmoving. The older man's expression remained unreadable, though his lips pressed into a thin line. "We don't need to involve outsiders. I'll have the staff bring her warm clothes and tea. She'll be fine in a few hours." "She just passed out. You don't know that." Ashton snapped, his frustration rising. "We need a real doctor." Sterling inhaled sharply through his nose, clearly displeased with being challenged. "Ashton, you're acting irrationally. You don't even know this woman." Ashton ignored him, shaking the woman gently. "Miss, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, and she let out a soft groan. Slowly, she turned her head toward him, her eyes glazed with exhaustion, but still locked onto his wrist. "The mark," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Ashton frowned, following her gaze to his own hand. His crescent-shaped birthmark. "What about it?" he asked, his voice softer now. Her fingers twitched as if she wanted to reach for him, but was too weak to do so. Her lips parted, as though she was about to say something important. Then she shivered violently, her body betraying her. That was enough for Ashton. "I'm taking her upstairs," he declared, rising to his feet and lifting her carefully into his arms. She weighed nothing, like she hadn't eaten properly in weeks. "Ashton," Sterling mourned, his voice tight. "This is a mistake." "Then it's my mistake to make." Ashton shot back over his shoulder as he carried her up the grand staircase. A room in a house too big. The guest rooms of the Carter estate were bigger than most apartments in the city. Ashton gently laid the woman down on the plush bed in one of them. He called for the housekeeper, instructing her to bring dry clothes, blankets, and hot tea. The older woman, Mrs. Collins, gave him a questioning look but obeyed without hesitation. She had raised Ashton like a second mother and rarely questioned his judgment. Sterling, however, was not so compliant. He stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold with thinly veiled irritation. "You realize the longer she stays, the harder this will be to undo, don't you?" Ashton rolled his eyes. "Undo what? I'm helping someone. That's not a crime." Sterling exhaled through his nose. "It's not about crime, Ashton. It's about the repercussions. You have a life planned out for you, a future that doesn't involve taking in strays who might be manipulating you." Ashton felt anger boil inside him. "Manipulating me?" She was half dead at our front gate. "What kind of manipulation is that?" "You don't know who she is," Sterling pressed. "People lie, especially when they're desperate." Ashton clenched his fists. "And what if she's telling the truth? What if this is bigger than just some random coincidence?" Sterling's sharp gaze locked onto Ashton's. "Then you should be even more careful." The older man turned and strode away, leaving Ashton staring after him, unease creeping up his spine. A familiar stranger. An hour later, the woman stirred. Ashton sat by her bedside, watching as her lashes fluttered open. For a moment, she just lay there, staring at the ceiling. Then her eyes flickered toward him. "You brought me here," she said softly. "You collapsed," Ashton said simply. "I didn't have a choice." Something flickered in her expression, something unreadable. Slowly, she pushed herself up, wincing as she did. She hesitated, as though she wasn't sure what to say. Then finally, "I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You're not," Ashton replied, then smirked slightly, though Sterling would definitely disagree. She didn't return the smile. Instead, she turned her gaze toward his wrist again. "The mark," she murmured. "It's really there." Ashton raised an eyebrow. "You said that earlier. What does that mean?" She hesitated, her fingers costing over the pendant around her neck, a small worn locket that looked like it had seen better days. She started but faltered. I don't know. You don't know? Ashton echoed, her hands clenched into fists. I can't remember. But when I saw it, I felt something. She swallowed. Something I haven't felt in a long time. Ashton studied her. There was real pain in her eyes, not just the exhaustion of someone who had spent too long struggling, but the kind of pain that came from forgetting something you desperately needed to remember. What's your name? He asked gently. She hesitated, then whispered, Mara. Just Mara. She gave a weak smile. It's all I can remember. Ashton's stomach twisted. There was something about her, something important, though he couldn't explain why. You don't remember where you're from, he pressed. She shook her head. Only pieces, a hospital, a child's laughter, and a name. She hesitated before saying it. Ashton. Ashton's breath caught in his throat. His name. His mind raced. How? How could she know his name if she didn't remember anything else? 1,000 thoughts spun through his mind, but before he could speak, a voice cut through the air. Ashton. Sterling stood in the doorway once more, his face a carefully controlled mask. I think it's time we had a talk. There was something in his tone that made Ashton's skin crawl. Something that told him this wasn't just about the woman in the bed anymore. Something bigger was at play. And whatever it was, he was about to find out. Secrets behind locked doors. Ashton followed Mr. Sterling down the grand hallway, his pulse pounding with unease. The mansion felt colder than usual, the dimly lit corridors stretching endlessly before them. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside eerily quiet, but inside, a different kind of storm was brewing. Sterling led Ashton to his private study, a room that had always felt off-limits. Even though Ashton had lived in the mansion for years, he had rarely been inside. It was the one place Sterling kept locked at all times. Tonight, that lock clicked open. Sit, Sterling ordered as he closed the heavy wooden door behind them. Ashton hesitated before lowering himself onto one of the leather chairs across from the desk. The room smelled of old books and polished wood, a strange mix of history and secrecy. Sterling didn't sit. Instead, he moved toward a large cabinet, pulled out a key from his pocket, and unlocked it. The doors creaked open, revealing a set of thick folders stacked neatly inside. Ashton, Sterling said, his voice unusually calm. Before you go any further down this path, there's something you need to know. He pulled out one of the folders and placed it on the desk in front of Ashton. Ashton stared at it, his heart hammering. His name was printed on the label. Carter, Ashton. He swallowed hard. What is this? Sterling folded his arms, watching him carefully. Your file. Everything about you that was kept hidden. Ashton hesitated before reaching forward. His fingers trembled as he flipped the folder open. Inside were documents, medical reports, adoption records. And then, photographs. The first one nearly stole the breath from his lungs. A baby wrapped in a hospital blanket, sleeping peacefully in a crib. His tiny wrist bore a crescent-shaped birthmark, identical to Ashton's. He flipped to the next photo. A woman holding the baby, her eyes filled with warmth, her hair slightly messy, but her smile radiant. A name was scrawled at the bottom in faded ink. Mara Davis. The world around him tilted. He flipped through more documents, his vision blurring as he scanned the text. Birth mother. Mara Davis. Hospital of birth. St. Jude's Medical Center. Disappearance. Declared missing after an accident. Custody transfer. Warren Sterling. Legal guardian. His entire body went numb. Mara is my mother. His voice was barely a whisper. Sterling's lips pressed together in a tight line. It would appear so. Ashton's chest tightened. You knew. Sterling exhaled, adjusting his glasses. I'd always known. Rage surged through Ashton so fast it made his hands shake. You knew, and you let me believe. You were better off not knowing. Sterling cut him off, his voice sharp. The world is cruel, Ashton. Your life, this life, is the only reason you didn't end up in foster care, bouncing between broken homes. You were given every advantage, every opportunity. You lied to me. Ashton shot up from his chair, his voice raw. Sterling's jaw clenched. I protected you. By stealing my mother from me. Ashton's breath was coming in short gasps, his mind spinning. Sterling didn't reply. Ashton grabbed the file, flipping through more pages in a frenzy. Hospital notes, injury reports, details about Mara's accident that led to her memory loss. That's why she didn't remember him. That's why she looked at his birthmark like it was the key to something buried deep inside her. Because it was. You knew where she was all this time, Ashton accused, his voice low with fury. You let her suffer out there, on the streets alone, while I lived in a mansion. Sterling's gaze was cold. She was unstable. Even if she had found you earlier, she wouldn't have been able to take care of you. Ashton clenched his fists. You don't get to decide that. Sterling straightened. I do when it concerns your future. Ashton's hands tightened around the papers. I don't need you controlling my future anymore. Without another word, he stormed toward the door. Ashton, Sterling called after him. He stopped, his back rigid. You think this will end in a happy reunion, Sterling said coolly. But the world doesn't work that way. You are Ashton Carter, son of wealth, the heir to a fortune. You're not the child of some woman who lost herself to the streets. Ashton turned, his eyes burning. She's not some woman. She's my mother. And then he walked out, slamming the door behind him. Truth in the darkness. Ashton didn't remember running up the stairs. He didn't remember bursting into Mara's room, the file clutched in his hands, his heart racing faster than it ever had before. All he knew was that she was awake, sitting up in bed, and when she saw the look on his face, she knew something had changed. Ashton, she asked hesitantly. He sat down beside her, his throat tight. You really don't remember, do you? He whispered, handing her the photo of her holding baby Ashton. She stared at it. Her fingers trembled as they traced the faded image. Her lips parted slightly, confusion and something deeper, something like recognition, flickering across her face. She breathed, her voice breaking. I know this. I know this feeling. Tears welled in her eyes. I held you, she whispered. Then a sharp gasp. Ashton watched as something clicked inside her. Her entire body tensed, as if something in her brain had finally unlocked. Flashes of memory flickered in her mind. A nursery painted soft yellow. A tiny hand gripping hers. Laughter echoing through a sunlit apartment. The scent of baby powder and warmth. And then, pain. A sudden impact. Cold pavement. Sirens. A hospital. Voices telling her to rest. Telling her she had lost something. Something precious. Her hands clutched her locket so tightly her knuckles turned white. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she looked at Ashton. I lost you, she whispered, her voice breaking. Ashton swallowed hard, his own vision blurring. But you found me, he whispered back. A strangled sob left her lips as she pulled him close, her frail arms wrapping around him. Ashton didn't hesitate. He held her just as tightly. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged, like his entire life had been leading to this moment. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Not with Sterling still in control. Not with the truth only now coming to light. Not with the battle that was still ahead. The war for the past. The night air was thick with the scent of rain and uncertainty. Ashton sat by the grand window in Mara's room, staring out at the Carter estate's perfectly manicured gardens, his mind a whirlwind of questions. Beside him, Mara lay curled beneath the heavy blanket, her breathing even but troubled, as though even in sleep, her body struggled to make sense of the memories she had lost. Ashton glanced down at the file still clutched in his hands. The weight of the truth felt suffocating. His entire life had been a carefully orchestrated lie. Sterling had stolen his history, rewritten it with wealth and expectations, making sure Ashton never questioned the empty spaces in his past. And the worst part, he almost got away with it. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Mrs. Collins, the longtime housekeeper, entered hesitantly, her kind eyes sweeping over him before landing on Maura. Her lips pressed together in concern. "You should get some rest too, Master Ashton," she said gently, nodding toward the bed. Ashton shook his head. "There's too much going on for me to sleep." Mrs. Collins hesitated before stepping inside, closing the door behind her. "I overheard part of your argument with Mr. Sterling earlier," she admitted. "You found out, didn't you?" Ashton's eyes snapped to her. "You knew." The older woman sighed, lowering herself onto the armchair near the fireplace. "Not everything, but enough to know that you weren't supposed to." Ashton's hands tightened into fists. "Why didn't you say anything?" Mrs. Collins looked at him, sorrow flickering across her face. "Because I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of what would happen to you if you ever questioned things too much. Sterling, he's powerful, Ashton. He spent years making sure no one could challenge his authority over your life." Ashton swallowed hard. "But Mara..." He turned his gaze toward his mother, still sleeping. He left her with nothing. He let her suffer. Mrs. Collins nodded gravely. "Because if she never found you, he could continue to control you." A heavy silence filled the room. Ashton exhaled sharply, standing up. "I'm not letting him win." Mrs. Collins gave him a worried look. "Be careful, Master Ashton. He's not going to let you go so easily." A guardian's wrath. Ashton didn't wait for morning. With the file clutched under his arm, he stormed toward Sterling's study, his blood boiling with determination. He threw open the door without knocking. Sterling looked up from his desk, unsurprised. If anything, he seemed expectant, as if he had been waiting for this confrontation. "Ashton," he said smoothly, setting his pen down, "I was wondering when you'd come to your senses." Ashton slammed the file onto the desk. "You stole my life." Sterling didn't flinch. "I saved your life." "Don't give me that." Ashton snapped. "You kept my mother from me. You let her believe she had lost everything while you raised me like some project you could control." Sterling leaned back in his chair, studying Ashton with that infuriatingly calm expression. "And yet, look at where you are. Look at what you've become. Do you honestly think you would have had this future if I had let a single mother with no resources struggle to raise you?" Ashton's jaw clenched. "That wasn't your choice to make." Sterling exhaled, adjusting his glasses. "Let's be realistic, Ashton. Do you think your mother can provide for you now? Even if her memories return completely, she has nothing. No home, no income, no stability." Ashton glared at him. "She has me." Sterling chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You think that's enough? The world doesn't work on sentiment, boy. It works on power. And you are not in a position to fight me." Ashton leaned forward, planting his hands on the desk. "We'll see about that." Sterling's eyes darkened. "You'd throw away everything I've built for you. Everything you built was based on a lie." Sterling's nostrils flared. "And what's your plan then? To take Maura, run off into the sunset, and pretend like you don't belong to this world anymore?" Ashton didn't answer. Sterling smirked, sensing hesitation. "You'll come back, because you won't survive without what I've given you." "You don't own me," Ashton growled. Sterling's expression turned cold. "Not yet." Something in his voice made Ashton's stomach drop. A threat too real. Ashton left the study, his mind racing. Sterling wasn't just going to let this go. He knew the man too well. He would find a way to make Maura disappear again, to erase her from Ashton's life for good. He needed to act fast. He rushed back to Mara's room, only to stop cold at the sight before him. The door was open. The bed, empty. A sharp pang of fear shot through him. "Mara," he called, stepping inside. The room was silent, the sheets still warm. His heart pounded. Then he saw it. A note placed neatly on the bedside table. With shaking hands, he picked it up. "Ashton, I have to leave. It's not safe here for me, or for you. You don't understand how dangerous Sterling is. He won't let me stay. He won't let me be your mother. I love you, but I won't let you lose everything because of me. Please don't come after me. Mara." Ashton froze, his breath shallow. "No," he whispered. His hands tightened around the note as realization hit him like a truck. She was running. Or worse, she had been forced to run. Sterling, his stomach twisted with fury. "Master Ashton." Mrs. Collins' frantic voice came from the hallway. He turned just as she reached the doorway, her face pale with fear. "She's gone," she gasped. "I saw one of Sterling's men leading her out the back gate. He threatened her." Ashton's blood ran cold. He turned on his heel, already rushing down the stairs. Mrs. Collins called after him. "Where are you going?" But Ashton didn't answer. He only knew one thing. He was getting his mother back, no matter what it took. The chase begins. The chandelier's glow barely reached Ashton as he stormed through the Carter mansion's halls. His thoughts were a chaotic storm, his pulse hammering like war drums. Sterling had made his move. He took Mara. Ashton barely registered the voices of the household staff as he ran down the main staircase, his heart pounding. His mind was screaming. Where would he take her? Why now? How do I stop this? Mrs. Collins' frantic voice followed him down the marble steps. "Master Ashton, wait. If Sterling's behind this, you can't just rush in. He's too powerful." Ashton whirled around, his breath ragged. And what? Let him get away with it. Again. The desperation in his voice made Mrs. Collins hesitate. But Ashton wasn't waiting for permission. He turned and ran to the garage. A locked cage. Meanwhile, Mara sat trembling in the back of a black luxury car, hands clenched into fists as she stared at the man sitting across from her. Warren Sterling. Even in the dim lighting, his ice-cold expression never wavered. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Sterling adjusted his sleeve, his tone calm but sharp. "Because you're a distraction, Mara. A mistake that should have stayed buried." She flinched. "A mistake." Sterling leaned forward, his eyes dark. "You think you belong in Ashton's world." He scoffed. "You don't. You never did. And if you truly love him, you won't drag him down with you." Mara felt a surge of anger, but fear held her still. Sterling continued, his voice turning low and measured. "Ashton is destined for great things. You're a woman with nothing. You couldn't even remember your own son for 8 years." The words sliced through her like knives. Sterling saw the pain in her eyes and smirked. "You're already doubting yourself, aren't you? Maybe Ashton really is better off without you." Mara looked away, her nails digging into her palms. But a single thought pulsed in her mind. "I won't let him take my son again." Sterling sighed, tapping on the tinted window. A moment later, the car slowed. "We're almost there," Sterling muttered. Mara's stomach twisted. Where was he taking her? She turned her head slightly, trying to peer through the window. But before she could get a glimpse of their destination, the car suddenly jerked to a stop. Reckless choices. Ashton's car skidded into the road, tires screeching as he cut off the black sedan ahead. His heart pounded as he threw open his door and stormed towards Sterling's car. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He just acted. The driver's door opened, and a massive man in a black suit stepped out, moving toward Ashton like a bodyguard trained for war. "Turn around, boy," the man warned. "Ashton." Mara's voice rang out from inside the car. Rage flared in Ashton's chest. "Let her go, Sterling." The back door opened. Sterling stepped out, calm as ever, smoothing out the crease in his jacket. "Ashton," he said smoothly. I suggest you go home. Now. Ashton's hands curled into fists. Not without her. Sterling let out a short, cold laugh. You think this is a negotiation? He glanced toward his driver, who took a step forward. Escort him back to the estate. The bodyguard lunged. But Ashton was faster. He dodged to the side, grabbed a heavy metal pipe lying on the roadside, and swung it. Crack cake. The bodyguard staggered, clutching his arm. Sterling's eyes widened slightly, surprised. That's enough, Ashton. No, it's not. Ashton snapped, breathing hard. You're not taking her away again. Sterling's expression darkened. Fine, he said coolly. Then, in a single swift motion, he pulled out his phone and made a call. Officer Rains, Sterling said, his voice all business. I'd like to report an assault and a reckless disturbance on private property. My ward has become aggressive and is interfering in a private matter. Ashton froze. Police. You. His voice cracked with rage. You called the cops on me. Sterling lowered his phone, smirking. I told you. You're not in control here, Ashton. A terrible realization dawned in Ashton's mind. Sterling wasn't just planning to remove Mara. He was planning to make Ashton look unstable. A desperate gamble. Mara's mind raced. She had spent years wandering, her past a blurred shadow. But one thing was clear now. She would not lose Ashton again. She acted before she could second-guess herself. In a swift movement, she threw herself out of the car, pushing past Sterling and running toward Ashton. Sterling grabbed for her arm, but she twisted away. Ashton, run, she shouted. Sirens wailed in the distance. The cops were coming. Ashton grabbed her wrist, his heart pounding. Come with me. Mara nodded without hesitation. They turned and sprinted into the night. Sterling's voice roared behind them. You're making a mistake, Ashton. But he didn't stop. He held onto his mother's hand as they ran, the city lights blurring around them. The Carter name meant nothing anymore. All that mattered was getting away. And for the first time in his life, Ashton felt truly free. Running from the past, fighting for the future. The night air burned in Ashton's lungs as he ran. Mara's hand gripped tightly in his own. The city lights blurred past, their glow flickering against the wet pavement. Behind them, sirens wailed, cutting through the air like a warning. We have to keep moving. Mara gasped, barely able to keep up with Ashton's pace. Her body was weak from years of struggle, but her spirit burned brighter than ever. Ashton pulled her forward, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. We need to get somewhere safe before Sterling's guys catch up. His mind raced. Sterling had planned this. Calling the police. That wasn't just to stop Ashton. It was to destroy him. If he was arrested tonight, the Carter fortune, his future, his credibility, everything would be twisted into Sterling's version of the truth. And Mara, his mother, would vanish again. He wasn't going to let that happen. A city that didn't care. They darted down an alleyway, their footsteps splashing through puddles. The sounds of the city surrounded them. Honking cars, muffled music from bars, the distant murmur of people who had no idea what was happening here, right now. Mara stumbled, her body weak from exhaustion. Ashton caught her just in time. You okay? She nodded, but her breathing was labored. Ashton scanned the streets ahead. They couldn't keep running aimlessly. He needed a plan. Fast. His eyes landed on a rundown motel sign flickering in the distance. Come on, he said, leading her toward it. The motel safe house. The motel smelled like cheap cigarettes and regret. Ashton slid a few crumpled bills across the counter to the disinterested clerk, keeping his head low. He didn't use his real name. He wasn't taking any chances. The clerk handed him a key without question. End of the hall, he muttered, barely looking up from his phone. Perfect. Ashton guided Mara toward the room, securing the door behind them the moment they stepped inside. The room was barely livable. A flickering lamp, peeling wallpaper, and a bed that looked like it had seen too much, but it was safe. For now. Mara sat on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking. Ashton. Her voice was heavy with emotion and exhaustion. He knelt beside her. I know. Tears welled in her eyes. I ran before. I let them take you. I didn't fight hard enough. Ashton shook his head. That wasn't your fault. She gripped his hand, looking straight into his eyes. But I'm here now, and I'm not running anymore. Ashton swallowed hard, emotion swelling in his chest. This woman, who had lost everything, who had been left with nothing, was still here. Still fighting for him. I'm not letting him take you again, he said fiercely. Mara nodded, determination sparking in her weary eyes. Then we fight. Sterling's next move. Back at the Carter estate, Warren Sterling stood in his study, staring at the city lights beyond the window. His jaw was tight, his fingers tapping against the desk. Ashton's smarter than I gave him credit for, he muttered. Behind him, Detective Raines stood with arms crossed. The cop was a man Sterling had bought and paid for years ago, always willing to bend the law for the right price. He won't get far, Raines said. The city's under watch. If he uses a credit card, contacts anyone from his old life, we'll find him. Sterling exhaled sharply, turning back to his desk. Find him before the media does. I won't have this scandal ruining the Carter name. And the woman? Sterling's eyes darkened. She's nothing, he said coldly. Once we get Ashton back under control, she'll disappear. Again. The plan to take down a king. Mara paced the motel room, her nerves raw. We can't stay here long, she said. Ashton agreed. He was already thinking 5 steps ahead. Sterling will have people looking for us, he muttered. We need a way to hit him where it hurts before he finds us. Mara sat down, deep in thought. His power comes from controlling your life. The Carter Empire, the money, the influence. She looked at Ashton. How do we take that away from him? A slow, dangerous smile spread across Ashton's face. We expose him. Mara frowned. How? Ashton grabbed his phone and pulled up an old contact, someone who had helped him cover for bad decisions in the past. Jake Calloway, a former hacker-turned-investigative journalist. Ashton hit dial. The line rang. And then, Ashton Carter. Jake's voice was smug. Heard you went off the rails tonight. You have no idea, Ashton muttered. I need a favor. Jake chuckled. Oh, this must be serious if the golden boy himself is calling me. What's the job? I need everything on Warren Sterling, Ashton said, his voice steady. Every illegal deal, every shady connection, every crime he covered up. There was a pause. Then, Jake let out a low whistle. Dan Carter, you really trying to start a war? Ashton's grip on the phone tightened. I'm trying to win one. Jake sighed. All right, I'll dig, but this kind of dirt doesn't come cheap. Ashton glanced at his wallet. He had some cash left, but he'd been cut off from the Carter fortune. Mara reached into her coat and pulled out something small. Her locket. She placed it in Ashton's hand. His eyes widened. Mara, no. She smiled sadly. It's worth something, isn't it? Ashton felt his throat tighten. This was all she had left. But she was willing to give it up, for him. He swallowed hard and turned back to the phone. We'll find a way to pay, he told Jake. Jake sighed. All right, Carter. I'll call you when I have something. Ashton hung up, his pulse racing. Mara's fingers brushed his arm. Are we doing the right thing? Ashton met her gaze, his eyes burning with resolve. We're taking back our lives. The storm before the war. Ashton knew time was running out. Sterling wouldn't wait. He would move fast, making sure that by morning, the world believed his version of the story. But Ashton wasn't that broken, obedient hare anymore. He was his mother's son. And this time, they were fighting back. Together. Striking back. The motel room felt too small, too fragile for the battle ahead. Ashton sat on the rickety wooden chair, elbows on his knees, his fingers steepled under his chin. Across from him, Mara sat with her back against the bed, arms wrapped around herself, her eyes distant. The weight of their decision settled between them like an approaching storm. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting back. And the first punch had to land hard. Uncovering the truth. Ashton's phone buzzed. Jake Calloway's name flashed on the screen. He answered immediately. "Tell me you've got something." Jake chuckled, but it wasn't amused. "Oh, Carter, I don't just have something. I have a gold mine. Sterling's been very busy over the years." Ashton sat up straighter. "What did you find?" Jake's tone turned sharp. "Money laundering, offshore accounts, illegal business dealings, but here's the real kicker. He falsified your adoption records." Mara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Ashton's blood ran cold. "What?" Jake continued. "Your adoption wasn't legal, Carter. Sterling manufactured paperwork to take custody of you after Mara disappeared. She was listed as missing and unfit due to her accident, but there was never an official court hearing. No judge ever signed off on it." Mara clenched her fists. "That means he stole my son through lies." "Exactly," Jake confirmed. "If this goes public, Sterling's reputation and control over you collapses." Ashton's pulse quickened. "Can you get this to the media?" "Already working on it," Jake said. "But if you want to speed things up, you need a public statement. Something undeniable." Ashton exhaled sharply. "A press conference." Jake snorted. "That's the Carter way. But good luck getting a platform. Sterling controls almost every outlet that would touch your story. You need to hit social media. Hard." Ashton's mind raced. Sterling had crafted his public image carefully. He had always been the cold, efficient businessman, shaping Ashton into the Carter Empire's heir. But if Ashton flipped the script, if he exposed the truth to millions, Sterling wouldn't be able to stop it. He looked at Mara, his determination solidifying. "We go public," Ashton said. "Tonight." Breaking the silence, they set up in the motel room, using the only weapon they had left. Ashton's name. With his phone propped against a cheap lamp for lighting, he hit record. He took a deep breath. Then he spoke. "My name is Ashton Carter," he began, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "I was raised to be the heir to the Carter Empire. But what no one knows is that my entire life was a lie." Mara gripped his hand tightly as he continued. "For 8 years, I was led to believe I was orphaned. But my mother, Mara Davis, was alive. She wasn't dead. She wasn't unfit. She was stolen from me." His hands tightened into fists. "Warren Sterling, my legal guardian, orchestrated everything. He forged adoption documents, erased my mother's existence, and built a life for me that was never meant to be his to control." Ashton locked eyes with the camera, his expression fierce. "This is my statement. I am renouncing Warren Sterling's guardianship. I am reclaiming my life, and I will make sure the truth about him is exposed." He hesitated only for a second before adding, "And if something happens to me or Mara, know that he is responsible." Then he ended the recording and hit upload. Mara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "It's done," she whispered. Ashton watched as notifications flooded in. Within minutes, the video had thousands of views. Comments exploded. "What the hell? Is this real? How did he get away with this? Sterling's finished if this is true." Ashton turned to Mara, his expression unreadable. "Now we wait. The empire cracks." At the Carter estate, Sterling's phone buzzed relentlessly. His assistant rushed into his study, her face pale. "Sir, you need to see this." Sterling took one look at Ashton's viral video and slammed his fist against the desk. That ungrateful boy. His carefully built empire was crumbling before his eyes. "Shut it down," he ordered coldly. His assistant hesitated. We can't. It's everywhere." Sterling's hands trembled. He had spent years orchestrating control over Ashton's life, and in a matter of minutes, that control was being ripped away. He grabbed his phone, his voice low and dangerous. "Find them," he snarled. "Now." A last desperate move. Ashton and Mara watched as the video gained traction. Jake's texts poured in. "You just started a war, Carter. News outlets are picking it up." Sterling's losing control of the narrative. Ashton exhaled. They had done it. But then, a loud bang echoed through the motel hallway. Mara flinched. What was that? Ashton's stomach dropped. Footsteps. Heavy, purposeful. His hands clenched into fists. They had been found. A voice rang out. "Ashton." It was Sterling's men. Mara grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do?" she whispered. Ashton looked toward the window. The fire escape. Their only way out. His pulse thundered. "We run," he said. "One last time." Then, he grabbed her hand, kicked open the window, and jumped into the night. A battle for freedom. The cold night air rushed past them as Ashton hit the fire escape landing with a thud. He pulled Mara after him, gripping her hand tightly as she stumbled onto the metal grating. "Go," he hissed, shoving her forward as shouts echoed behind them. The motel door slammed open, and heavy boots pounded against the wooden floors inside. "They're on the fire escape," one of Sterling's men barked. Adrenaline surged through Ashton's veins as he and Mara raced down the metal stairs, the city glowing beneath them like an electric storm. A sharp crack rang out. A bullet shattered the metal railing just inches from Ashton's shoulder. Mara screamed. "Keep moving," Ashton urged, nearly dragging her down the last few steps. They hit the pavement running. Behind them, the goons poured out of the motel, their suits ridiculously out of place in the filthy alleyway. Ashton yanked Mara into the shadows, ducking behind a dumpster as the men fanned out. They went this way. Ashton's heart slammed against his ribs. He turned to Mara, his voice low but urgent. "We have to split up." Mara's eyes widened in fear. "No, it's the only way." "They'll chase me, not you," Ashton whispered. "Go to Jake. Tell him what's happening. I'll meet you there." Mara's hands trembled, but she nodded, her face pale. "Ashton," she whispered, her voice breaking. He squeezed her hand one last time. "I'll find you. I promise." Then, before she could stop him, he bolted into the street, drawing their attention. "There he is." The chase was back on. The hunter becomes the hunted. Ashton dodged past pedestrians, weaving through the crowded sidewalk. He grabbed a trash can and knocked it over, sending garbage spilling into the path of his pursuers. A black car screeched to a stop as he sprinted across an intersection, nearly getting clipped by a taxi. G8 him. They were gaining. Ashton's legs burned, his lungs screamed, but he pushed forward, ducking into a narrow alleyway. He leaped over a fence, his fingers scraping against the rusty metal. Behind him, the men vaulted after him. One grabbed the back of his shirt. Ashton threw an elbow back, connecting with the man's jaw. The thug stumbled, giving Ashton just enough time to dive into a side street. His mind raced. He needed a way to lose them. Fast. Then he saw it. An abandoned subway entrance. Perfect. Below the city. Ashton hurled himself down the stairs, his breath ragged. The tunnel smelled like rust and stale water, but it was empty. Exactly what he needed. He sprinted deeper, his footsteps echoing against the concrete walls. Behind him, the men hesitated at the entrance. "He won't go far," one of them growled. "Fan out. Cut off all exits." Ashton's chest tightened. He had nowhere to go. The tracks stretched endlessly into darkness. The station was shut down. No running trains, just miles of abandoned tunnels. His only chance. Disappear. He ducked behind an old maintenance shed, pressing himself flat against the wall. His heart pounded in his ears. Footsteps echoed closer. A flashlight flickered through the darkness. "Ashton." It was Sterling's voice. "I know you're here," he called, his tone smooth, calm. "This is pathetic, really, hiding in a sewer like a rat." Ashton's hands clenched into fists. Sterling stepped into the tunnel, his shoes clicking against the damp ground. "You think you can escape me?" he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "I've controlled your entire life. Do you really believe you're free?" Ashton's stomach twisted. Then he saw it, a loose section of tunnel wall. A way out. Silently, he slipped toward it, his muscles tensed. Sterling kept talking. "You can't survive without me," he sneered. "You have nothing." Ashton reached the loose wall panel, sliding through just as the flashlight swung in his direction. He held his breath. "Search the tunnels," Sterling ordered. "Find him." Ashton didn't wait. He ran. Reuniting with Mara. Mara paced nervously in Jake's hideout, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her sleeves. Every second felt like an eternity. Then the door burst open. "Ashton." She rushed forward, throwing her arms around him. He held her tightly, exhaustion weighing on his limbs. "I'm here." Jake whistled. "You look like hell, Carter." Ashton dropped onto the couch, rubbing his temples. "Sterling's got the cops looking for me. His men are everywhere." Mara's expression hardened. "We have to end this. Tonight." Jake smirked. "Good news. I just sent everything to the press. By morning, the whole city will know what Sterling did." Ashton nodded, relieved. "Then we just have to survive the night." Jake leaned back, cracking his knuckles. "I'll keep an eye on the news. You two get some rest." Mara hesitated before speaking. "Ashton, when this is over, what happens next?" He met her gaze, his eyes softening. "We start over," he said. "Together." Mara's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't from pain. For the first time in 8 years, she had her son back. And no one would take him away again. Epilogue. The fall of Warren Sterling. By morning, the world knew. The news exploded. Corporate giant Warren Sterling exposed for adoption fraud and corruption. Illegal guardianship documents uncovered. Carter Hare speaks out. A billionaire's empire crumbles overnight. Sterling tried to fight back, but it was too late. The FBI raided his estate. His assets were frozen. His men disappeared, abandoning him to the fallout. And when the police came for him, he had nowhere left to run. A new beginning. 1 month later, Ashton and Mara stood in a quiet park, the chaos finally behind them. Mara breathed in deeply, the sunlight warming her skin. "I still can't believe it's over," she whispered. Ashton chuckled. "Believe it." She turned to him, her eyes full of something new. "Hope. You don't have to take care of me, you know," she said. "I don't expect." Ashton cut her off with a smile. "I want to." Mara laughed softly, brushing a tear from her cheek. For years, she had searched for something she couldn't name. Now she knew. It was home. And she had finally found it.